Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Focus on the User Experience, Key Strategies for SharePoint and Office 365. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer your questions, someone will follow up with you via email. And we'll also make a recording of the webcast available within a couple of days. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer at EMEA at Harmony. Richard works directly with Harmony field teams and partners, bringing with him 17 years of experience in data management systems. Richard has helped many companies to realize significant benefits in productivity enabled by collaborative platforms. Richard earned his Bachelor of Engineering degree in Automotive Engineering from Loughborough University. Richard, please get us started.
Thanks, Susan, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody who's joined from various locations. So today's session is really focused on the areas of SharePoint and Office 365 that are really key in making those systems successful in your organization. And we've highlighted a number of different areas that we're going to touch on today. But before we go into the details of those, we'd just like to ask an initial poll question on how you're actually managing your data today.
So the question is, where do your users currently store their critical documents? And please select all that apply, your shared drives, public folders, OneDrive, SharePoint, or another document management system. And while we're waiting for you to answer, Richard, give me just another minute.
Yep.
Let's see that people are answering. Wow, it's close here. SharePoint and shared drive so far are your biggest, but let's just give it a couple seconds and see where we're
Okay.
at. All right. All right, I'm going to put it up for you to see. There you go. It's all yours.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Susan, and thank you everybody for participating in that. So yeah, obviously it looks like there's a large proportion of you that are using SharePoint to some degree, but there's an equally large proportion of you that are also using shared drives, maybe for legacy reasons or because end users are still kind of, I think, struggling a little bit to adopt the document management systems that you're putting in place. Also, I can see that there's about a quarter of people are still using public folders as well to manage their emails. So let's just hide those results and then we can take a look at each of these different areas. So let's just hide that. There we go. So I think one of the key things that actually that question is, and the results has just highlighted that people are using different repositories to store both their emails and their documents, and there's a number of challenges involved in that. I think firstly, having data separated in different interfaces in different silos poses a challenge to end users, so that they struggle to find the content, but also they struggle to know where to put their content in the first instance. If there's, for any reason, a barrier to using SharePoint or using metadata or content types or those kind of things, people tend to resort back to what they're familiar with. So for documents, that might well be file shares. And for emails, that may well be just managing them themselves in their own PST files or public folders, for example. But obviously, as things are evolving, as you're moving, typically a lot of people are obviously moving towards Office 365 as well, where public folders are really not available anymore. So there is a real requirement to find a single repository for all of those all that content, whether it's documents or emails, into a single place, but also from a point of view of actually discovering content, having it in a single place, having it in context with each other. So for example, a project that I'm working on, maybe I've got some dialogue that I've discussed with the client, and I've got some documentation either that they've sent me or that we're preparing to reply back to them with. And Harmony helps the end users to achieve that in a very intuitive and easy to use interface by using SharePoint as that single repository for all related information that you need to capture. And it may be, you know, around legal case matters, or it could be around project management, or it could be client management, or whatever areas your business users need to manage their content. And having an integration into Outlook that gives you easy access into your SharePoint environment, we allow you to capture your content very, very easily. For example, dragging emails and attachments into SharePoint, but also, for example, taking content from a shared folder or a local drive and getting that into SharePoint in the same way. Or, for example, if I've received further documentation and I want to get that into SharePoint as new versions, then Harmony helps me to do that. So let's just take a look at how that works in practice. And if we go into, let's say, a document library here, we can see that I've got some documents and I've also got some emails in context with each other in this particular document library. I can then go ahead and kind of separate those out, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail later, that we can see, you know, here's the documents that are in this library, but also here's kind of a lot of, sorry, there's the emails and here are the documents. And so capturing content is really, you know, the first step of that puzzle, really. So for example, here where I've got an email that I've received, and I need to get that into SharePoint to share it with my colleagues, I can simply drag and drop, you know, multiple emails into the sidebar to upload them into SharePoint, capture all the metadata, mark them in my Outlook, for example. But in exactly the same way, if I've received some documentation either as an attachment or from maybe I've got some content on a local machine, local folder, for example, I can do it in exactly the same way. And Harmony knows how to handle documents and emails in the same environment, but handle them differently. So, for example, here, I've just dragged in a file, and now I'm being prompted to choose the relevant content type for that particular document that I'm uploading, and then I'm going to be prompted with any particular metadata that I need to fill in. So, for example, here there may be some required properties that I need to fill in, and then those documents are automatically checked in for me. So having, you know, both emails and documents in the same interface is really, as I say, the first piece to that puzzle. And as I say, if I've got some content maybe on a local machine or a shared drive, I can also capture that in exactly the same way and go through that same process. So having that consistent user interface, but also a consistent single repository is a big leap for a lot of people, and also it makes it a lot more intuitive to know where to put their content. So getting content into SharePoint is one thing, into a single place. The other thing is kind of, how do I stay informed about information as it evolves? So how do I know that somebody else is already working on maybe making some changes to a document that I've been working on? Or how do I find the latest version, all those kind of things. Doing that in separate interfaces, in separate document management systems, file shares, for example, it's very difficult for end users, very distracting and very confusing. You know, you've got to look in a number of different places. So having that, again, all in one interface and also in a simple interface in Harmony really helps them. So, you know, being able to, for example, manage your document versioning directly within Harmony, following locations for activity and being informed when new updates actually occur, all within kind of a single interface that isn't distracting to the end user, really helps people. So for example here, we've just captured these documents and emails that relate to this project. I've already marked that as a favorite and I'm following it for activity. We can also make it available offline, and we can use it in Outlook rules and things for automating the capture of content. But at the moment we just want to focus on how do I know when somebody else has made a change, for example, to this contract. And I don't want to receive lots of emails that are just going to be more distracting than helpful. So Harmony has an update stream that allows me to stay informed when there are new updates. So you'll see here a red dot appears on what we call the People tab in Harmony, which has a number of different areas, one of which that I just wanted to focus on for a few minutes is this update stream. So here I can choose the favorite locations that I've marked that I want to follow, and I can choose which ones I actually want to see updates from. So it might be that I just want to see updates from a few particular locations, and then from there I can see any new activity, and also I can filter that down. So if I'm interested, let's say, in just proposal documents or updates to any proposals that I'm following, I can see that activity directly in the sidebar. I can click on the document to go directly to it. I can see the version history of that document, for example, and stay very focused on what I need to actually work on, all within the context of the sidebar that we have here. So I can see, for example, here the version history of anything that's actually changed. Let's just go back a second to where we were working before, and move on to the next concept that we wanted to discuss. Because obviously capturing content and being notified when there's new updates and things is one thing, and it's great. The next thing is, what about I need to share the content that I'm working on with my colleagues, but also my clients. And in this instance, I've as an end user, I might have a bit of a dilemma here. I'm putting content into SharePoint, but if I need to share some of those documents with internal colleagues, I don't actually know if they've got permission to access the document that I'm sending to them. And if they're an external collaborator, let's say, maybe a client or a contractor or whatever, who maybe I know that it isn't going to have access to my SharePoint, I may need to send that document to them as attachments. So having all of those capabilities within one single interface really helps me as a business user to actually use SharePoint as that central repository and share the content with people as and when I need to share it with them. So let's take a look at a few scenarios there around that kind of functionality. So for example, if we go back to, let's say, this document library that we were working on before, and maybe I want to send an email to Susan. So let's compose a new email and say that this is a new contract. So, hi Susan. Please. And then I can simply drag and drop documents from anywhere within Harmony into the body of the email. So for example here, I could choose by default to send that as a link, and that really helps end users to start to use links and send links, and when people receive those links, for example, they can right-click on them and say open in Harmony, and it will direct Susan directly to that document without her having to go and search for it. But also, it's not necessarily opening a document that Susan might want to see. She might want to see the metadata or the properties or anything, and she can do that as soon as she's clicked that link in Harmony. Now, I don't know if Susan's got access to this link, but I'm going to send it to her anyway. And Harmony has a mechanism there to actually check whether the people that I'm sending links to actually have access. And we can see here that actually Susan doesn't have access to this document. So at this point, I can choose to give her view or edit capabilities, and that's using the ad hoc sharing capabilities of SharePoint Online or Office or OneDrive. So I can choose to grant Susan access if, for example, she's a colleague in the same organization. So I know that she's a SharePoint user, but in this case I'm being told she doesn't have permission, so I can grant her some access. If it's actually, maybe I need to send this to an external party, and I know that they don't have access to SharePoint, and I'm not going to grant it to them either, I may need to send it as an attachment, and I can do that just by holding down the Alt key on the keyboard while I drag and drop the document into the email, and that will then send that document as an attachment. So again, coming back to that kind of consistent user experience across, working with different parties, different collaborators, and different content, really helps the end user to kind of make some order of the kind of confusion that they have. So let's take a look at kind of organizing some of the content that end users are working on. And here, this is really, focusing on metadata. I think a lot of business users really struggle to kind of make the leap from working in a folder structure, for example, to embracing metadata. And I think there's a couple of different reasons for that. I think firstly, if end users see it as extra work for them, they're very likely to get, to avoid it and say, actually, I'll just put the documents in a shared folder and send somebody a link to that instead or something, or let them find it. But also, I think, from an end user's point of view, if they don't see the benefit of having the metadata there themselves, they won't see the kind of why they're actually entering metadata and kind of taking that extra step. So I think, the key here is automating as much of that metadata as possible, whether it's header information from emails that you're capturing, like we saw before, or whether it's, properties that are in Office documents that are going to be mapped to columns in SharePoint, but also presenting it to users in an intuitive way is really key there. And also then being able to edit the metadata in a very easy manner, particularly on multiple items, because obviously, as you progress with your SharePoint content, you're not talking about one or two documents. You're talking about hundreds of documents in libraries, and being able to actually update those en masse is really easy with Harmony. And also then taking a look at the other side of the consumption of metadata. The value of metadata to me as an individual is it means that it can help me to actually find and organize my content. So let's take a look at both of those really. So firstly, as we saw before, these documents, let's just close that for a second. Here we go. So these documents that, or documents that I've captured, or emails that I've uploaded. As I mentioned before, we can automate the capturing of the email metadata, things like the subject, who the emails were sent from and to, and things, so that users aren't pestered. Also, if you remember when I dragged an email in, if we just take another one as an example, we're not actually asking the user to select the content type for that item because we know it's an email. So we can pre-configure the content type that should be used for that. But when I take a document, then we want to prompt the user to choose the content type and fill in the specific metadata. And if we take a look at some of that metadata as well, so let's say maybe this contract that we saw earlier, then I can view and edit the properties directly from here. But what I can also do is I can filter the properties down so that the user doesn't get too distracted by, let's say, some optional or unnecessary metadata that doesn't apply in 99% of the kind of actions that they're working on. So here we can see that I can filter just on the required properties, and then I can go ahead and update those properties nice and easily and make that available to other users. So being able to do that, obviously in that instance on an individual item is one thing, but being able to do that on multiple items is another. So for example here I can take multiple documents, let's say these documents here, and say that I actually want to tag those with some specific common metadata. So I can select multiple items. We can see that I've got 4 documents selected. I can see all of the common properties across all of those documents as well. So let's say I want to tag these as for a particular industry or particular initiative or something like that. So let's say these are all to do with, let's say, community building in this case. So I want to tag them with that information in one hit. And I can do that really, really easily, and then that's very powerful so that people can use that metadata moving forward, as we mentioned. So there's a number of different ways that Harmony supports the use of and consumption of metadata. So for example here, if I just want to see documents that were tagged for that collaboration, that community building, then I don't need to type in the whole term, for example. Harmony knows and understands the taxonomy that you have defined in your SharePoint environment, and there we'll see documents that have been tagged with that information in a number of different ways. Also, we can filter information by columns. So for example, if I just want to see documents that have been updated by certain individuals in this case, or by any choice type properties in your SharePoint libraries. We can also search for content directly within the sidebar, and then that uses a SharePoint search capability. So there's a number of different ways to really work and utilize metadata in Harmony, and obviously that metadata is then available in SharePoint as well. So we're not kind of saying that everybody has to use Harmony 99 or 100% of the time, but for I think a lot of people's day-to-day kind of working, they can carry that out directly from within the sidebar. I think another challenge that that people have, particularly moving to Office 365, for example, is where do I store my documentation at different stages of a process? I've got OneDrive, I'm a member of some groups, I've got access to some team sites. When do I put a document into each of those, and why, and for what reason, and also how does documentation, as it goes through maybe how does it evolve and move through those locations? If I'm putting some content into my OneDrive now, how do I get it into a team site later on when I want to share it with somebody? And I think users get very distracted and very confused about what they should use when, why, and where. So let's take a look at that in Harmony, because from Harmony we can actually connect to all 3 of those environments. And then from a team site point of view, it could be that you're working with some on-premise sites, or you're also working with some SharePoint Online sites as well. Having a consistent user experience and user interface really, really helps end users to kind of get their head around where they should be working. So let's take a look at all the sites that I'm connected to here. As I mentioned, we can go to my OneDrive. I can see the documents that I'm working on that are personal to me, and I can work on them directly from here, nice and easily. Likewise, I can go to my Office groups, and I can see all the groups that I'm a member of, whether they're public or private groups, see all the documents that are shared within that group, and obviously work on them from here as well. And likewise, as we saw before, in a SharePoint team site. So I can see all my document libraries and the contents of that in one single interface. And I think that's a big hurdle for a lot of end users, is to get that consistency and make it easy. So let's take a look at kind of how some content might evolve. So if I go into my OneDrive and say, for example, I've got a document here that I'm working on, and I want to now actually share that content with some of my colleagues, maybe a group that I'm a member of. So I can easily just copy and paste that content from one interface into another, directly within the same Harmony sidebar. So let's take that document from my OneDrive and go into a group that I'm a member of. And then I can simply paste that document into that group, and anybody who's a member of that group can now access that document and start contributing to it. Then maybe a bit later on, once something has been worked on, so let's take a different document here to say, actually, we've been working on this overview here, and now I need to get that into SharePoint. So I can do that in exactly the same way. So I can copy that document and go into a SharePoint team site, paste that, let's say, into the library that we were using before, and then I'm prompted to choose the content type for that document. Now it's in a team site. So it has that consistent look and feel, that consistent kind of way of working, but as it evolves through the kind of life cycle of a project or a client or whatever, then I can go ahead and say, well, actually, this is now a proposal, and I need to fill in the required metadata in that particular library. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's in process, and it's to do with knowledge management. There we go. I'm also prompted to check that in automatically as well to make sure that other people can access it. And let's take a look at the concept of kind of reusing data and knowledge that you may have already experienced, or some of your colleagues may have already experienced. You know, a lot of particularly kind of project-based and client-based activity is quite similar to previous projects that you've done. So it can be very challenging to avoid making the same mistakes that you've made or your colleagues have made on previous projects elsewhere that may be similar. And also, you know, starting from something that you've already learned from. So, for example, finding some content that is similar to a project that you're working on, and then putting it into a new library and start working on it from there. So you're not working from scratch every time. So kind of consolidating a few of the elements that we've already touched on around kind of, you know, searching, finding, copying, pasting content from one library into another really helps. And then obviously, if you, as those documents can evolve, it's you know, the new version, the new content will also add to that kind of knowledge capture. But also, Harmony has introduced recently a new component called Collage, where we can actually bring together information from a number of different sources and present it to the user that are relevant to, for example, an email that you've received. So let's take a look at a few of those examples. So as I mentioned before, if I want to find, let's say, proposals in either this particular document library or this site, I can see the context of my search and say that I've actually found a number of different proposals in a number of different locations. So now I want to search across all of my sites, and you'll see that the results are obviously different depending on the scope of the search that I run. And in this case, it's returned some items in some lists. Or it might be some documents where, you know, there's metadata that meets that criteria, or it could be a document where there's the criteria is found within the content of the actual document itself. And then, for example, as we saw before, I can just go ahead and copy that document and paste it into the library that we are working in now. So again, I can really start to work on evolving that documentation from experience that we've learned on previous projects. as I mentioned, Harmony takes that to the next level in terms of actually presenting information to you in context as well. So for example, if I take an email here from one of our customers, we can then click on the collage tab, and that will actually analyze the email that I've selected. And what it's doing there is it's analyzing it for topics, for keywords that it can identify. So in this case, it's identified the name of the account from this particular email. I can also add in other topics and things if I know that this relates to a particular project, or maybe it's facilities management or something. And then I can add that as a new topic, and that will then remain there so that I can use those topics to actually navigate around my content. Now, I'm actually connecting here to a number of different web services. It could be, in this case, SharePoint for my document management, Outlook for my emails, my CRM system, which could be Salesforce or Dynamics, for example, my social platform in Yammer, or we use Zendesk as our support system. So it's actually, because it's identified the account from one of these topics, it's highlighted information about that account in our CRM system that I can get to. I can see if there's any opportunities existing on that particular account. I can also reach out to the account manager and those kind of things, but also I can see any other updates coming from documents and emails and support calls and things that relate to that client as well, based on the topics that we've actually highlighted. So for example, here we've got some other emails that relate to this particular client, some other documents that relate to that account, and I can start to use those as ways to navigate information. So in this case, maybe this is highlighted that is some mobile topics in this other email that it's selected. So if I select mobile there, then it takes me to relevant content that is then filtered by or tagged as relevant to mobile initiatives, or I can search for content and things as well. So let's say I'm just interested in Office 365, let's say. Oops. And select that as a topic, and then I'll see any updates that have been tagged for Office 365 across all of those interfaces, whether it's a support call in Zendesk, an email in my Outlook, or a document in SharePoint. I think lastly, capturing content, managing it, sharing it and stuff is really important. But I think one thing that a lot of people kind of forget about is, getting content into SharePoint is one thing, but making sure that other people can access it is another. And one of the most fundamental things there is people leaving documents checked out. It's very easy to do. It might be for a number of different reasons. It might be I'm working long term on some content and I'm not going to check it in every day, for example. But Harmony facilitates kind of prompting the user to guide their hand. So for example, like we saw before, when I've finished editing a document or editing some metadata, it will prompt me to actually check that document in to make it available to other users. But also being able to see the content that I've got checked out to me, maybe if it's the end of the week or I'm going on holiday or something, and I need to check that information in so that other people can carry on with their work while I'm away. Let's just take a look at that last scenario, excuse me, in Harmony as well. So as we saw before, if I want to edit some metadata, I can go ahead and do that directly from here. Let's say I want to update who the owner of this particular document is and save that. Then Harmony will automatically check that in, and if I check it out manually, then it will automatically check it in when I edit any properties as well. So let's say I want to just update that to Fred, for example. Then it will prompt me to check that document in, so we could say changed owner. And making it again, why a crawler face is making it easy to use, and also then, as I said before, if I've got some documents that are checked out to me, and maybe I've got hundreds of documents in here, then Harmony adds a view here that just shows me the documents that are checked out to myself, and at the end of the day I can just select all of those in that single view, check them all in, add any versions that I need to, any comments that I need to, and then that disappears from that view. So I can have that as kind of as a best practice to make sure everybody can access the documents that I've been working on before I go away for a few days. So hopefully you've all learnt a few things from the areas that we've highlighted today. A lot of our documentation is all available online, so user documentation, there's some links here, and training videos and things. And also, if you're not using Harmony yet yourselves, then there is a link there to request an enterprise trial. So we just wanted to ask a last poll question regarding how you see a kind of single user experience.
Do you see value in providing your business users with a single intuitive user interface? Is really what Richard wants to ask you. Okay, and resoundingly the answer is yes.
Excellent.
Is that all the questions, Richard? I'm going to actually bring up the last poll question, which is, in addition to the link, if you would like a 30-day collage evaluation license, you can just answer here and we'll have someone get in touch with you. And while people are answering the question, I will look at the questions that have been coming in. Let's see. Does this handle OneNote documents?
Yes, I mean, OneNote documents can obviously reside in a SharePoint library, so Harmony can access the OneNote directly from those libraries, open it up, and obviously there are all the supporting documents that reside around a OneNote, you know, the actual notebook itself.
Great, thank you. And how does this work with MS CRM?
So with regard to Microsoft CRM, as I mentioned before, on the collage side, we're pulling in information relating to, for example, an account based on topics that have been identified. So if we just take a look at the collage tab again, we can see the services here. I have the option to connect to either Dynamics or Salesforce as CRM systems. Personally, we use Salesforce ourselves, but it works in exactly the same way as we showed earlier with regard to identifying the account information, pulling in the kind of summary information from that account. If I then want to open that up into another interface, then I can do that from here as well. Were there any other questions at the moment?
Yeah, okay. So the next question is Harmony compatible with two-factor authentication on Office 365?
Yes, absolutely. So we do, as I mentioned before, we support both on-premise and online environments, and we also support all the different kind of authentication mechanisms you may have. So, for example, here, if you're using two-factor authentication on Office 365, the option to use there is the browser authentication, because then we actually delegate the authentication to a browser session, and basically then there's no credentials that Harmony is kind of prompting for. It's actually delegating that to the browser kind of mechanism. If you're using just normal authentication in Office 365, you can use the custom credentials just to provide your username and password. Or if you're working on a kind of on-premise environment, all in the same kind of contained environment, then you can automatically pick up your Windows credentials.
Great, thank you. There are a lot of questions, but so that we can finish early and give us all a little time, I'm just going to give you one more question here, which I see. How good is Harmony with mobile access?
Okay, so we do have a couple of different options really on the mobile side. Firstly, we have a standalone application, and if you just bear with me a second, I will just bring up my iPad on the screen, so hopefully you can see that now. So here we can see that I've got a standalone Harmony mobile app that I can access the same kind of content that I had on the desktop and the Outlook integration, and because it's a kind of standalone application, it means that it's really quite a rich interface into SharePoint. So if we take a look, for example, at that kind of construction site that we were working in before, I can see all the same content, the documents that we've been working on, the emails that we captured, and I can also access that content while I'm disconnected as well. So I can synchronize this information for offline access, and we can see here that it's just because I'm connected, it's synchronizing that to make sure I've got the latest version of that document. And then when I go offline, I can still access all the metadata, I can access the documents themselves, I can work on them. In this case it's a PDF, so I can actually annotate that document directly within the Harmony mobile app. What we can also do is utilize the OWA app functionality as well to actually capture emails. So for example here, if we take a look at the email view in this library, we can see the emails that we captured from my Outlook, along with all of the header information and those kind of things. And I can also view those emails directly within the Harmony mobile app as well. So let's say that this is an email that I uploaded previously, and I can see all the content of that email, if there's attachments, all those kind of things. But also, as I say, using the OWA app, we can actually save emails and attachments directly into SharePoint and capture the header information like we do on the kind of desktop Outlook integration as well.
Great. Thank you, Richard, for a wonderful presentation, and thank everyone for joining us today. You'll all receive an email with a link to view the webinar within a couple of days, and we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar.